best job.
Yeah, no, I will. I
She's
think
sitting at home watching. She said if I saw you say she would have liked to give you in person. She had a meeting that only ended at 5.
I think for the people on
When you start Twitter, we're going to speak across the fence. You are away. Even away, right?
I think only 25, just before half past.
Okay. We've got a few minutes. lots of cyclists.
Yeah, no, I haven't told you it's better. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the hybrid inaugural lecture of Professor Robert Lamberts. May I please ask you to stand for the entrance of the academic procession.
Please take your seat. Good evening, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, friends, family. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Nico van Pittius. I'm the Vice Dean of Research and Internationalization of the Faculty of Medicine and Health Sciences. It's a great pleasure for me to welcome you all here this evening. A special welcome to our Rector, Vice Chancellor, Professor Wim de Villiers. Thank you for being here, Professor de Villiers, and of course the candidate, Professor Rob Lamberts. A special word of welcome also to Prof. Lamberts' special guests, including his wife and son, as well as his parents and brother, who are all attending online. We also welcome all the guests from outside the university and also our colleagues from Stellenbosch and, of course, from the faculty. As you all know, inaugural lectures are an important part of our faculty's tradition. These are events where we celebrate our colleagues who are coming into the full professoriate and who has a long career, academic career behind them. It's a defining moment in all academics' lives and a moment that says that you've made this significant contribution to your field and to the discipline. So it's a platform for our candidates to tell us what they've done and who they are and the body of research that they've been focusing on during their careers, and a celebration of their achievements. And therefore we're very proud to have Prof. Lamberts here this evening to do that. It's a special occasion for us, and we hope that you enjoy this evening with Professor Lamberts. Thank you very much. I will now hand over to the Dean, Professor Elmi Miller, to please introduce the candidate. Thank you.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and people online. It's a great pleasure to introduce Rob Lamberts to you tonight. Now, Rob was born and raised in the Netherlands and came to Stellenbosch for the first time in 1997 when he was an elective student, and at that time he came to the division of physiotherapy. He then completed his physiotherapy degree and decided to do an MSc with a focus on education and human movement sciences back in the Netherlands. But he fell in love with South Africa, and he came back to come and write up his MSc research project in the Division of Exercise Science and Sport Medicine at UCT, where he worked for the next 3 years, and his work was focused on complex cardiac rehab. And he then immigrated to South Africa formally in 2004. He did a PhD in exercise science at UCT and completed that PhD in 2009. It's remarkable to see that he actually published 16 peer-reviewed articles during that time. Quite a lot of work that he did. After that, he remained in a postdoctoral fellowship position, and that was done at UCT, and then moved over to Stellenbosch University in 2013. At that stage, the Institute of Sport and Exercise Medicine was situated in the division of orthopedic surgery, so he worked in that division, and then officially moved in 2020 to the Department of Exercise, Sport and Lifestyle Medicine, where he is working today. Now, Rob is a very productive researcher, and he is the head of the master's and the doctoral committee in his department, but also serves on the postgrad research and health ethics committee. He was promoted to a full professor on the 1st of August 2017, and that is what we are celebrating tonight. His field of expertise is to monitor training load and recovery in high-performance cycling. So he's done a lot of work in sport research, but he's also conducted multiple research projects on healthy aging in adults with cerebral palsy. He's published over 100 peer-reviewed scientific papers. He has an H-index of 23, a Scopus index of 28, and is a very well-known South African researcher. He's also the Associate Editor of the International Journal of Sports Physiology and Performance, and a board member of the European College of Sports Science. So Rob, thank you for sharing this evening with us, your expertise and your knowledge. Welcome, and we look forward to your talk.
So let me take my hat off before we go, and a special welcome to the people and the people of the procession here in the front. Professor Wim de Villiers, very honored to see you here. I know you're an avid cyclist yourself as well and a sportsman, so hopefully I can enjoy you with this inaugural lecture. Professor Elmi Miller, thank you for heading up the faculty. Nico van Pitjes, thank you being here as well, and of course my head of department Wayne Durman, and Karen Wellman, the head of the division. So yeah, where do we start? Well, we start around the topic of finding the balance in high performance cycling, and before I start I'll give you a brief overview of what I'm going to talk about today. So I'm going to give you a little bit of background about my personal background, where I come from, how I landed up in South Africa, and we've briefly touched on this just now. All right. Now, I stand here today as a celebration of my full professorship, but this is clearly not something that you do by yourself. This is a celebration of all the authors that I've been able to work with, that I've published together with. So without shifting the whole thing away from me, this is definitely a celebration of all the people that I work with and all the divisions that I've been part of. And so presenting the work here today is not purely mine. It's a presentation of the work that follow through those collaborations as well. Briefly touching on this, I'm currently head of the research within the Division of Movement Science and Exercise Therapy. And as we walk through the different components already, I chair a few different other roles as well. And I also sit on the Health Research Ethics Committee. And I'm glad to see that there are some representation from that office as well. I've been serving there nearly 8 years, and it's been always exciting to do some work for them as well. I've got a background in physiotherapy, as we just heard. I did an MSc in pedagogics with a specialization in human movement sciences and a PhD in exercise science. And as you probably picked up already from the introduction just now, I was born and raised in the Netherlands. Now, I was born and raised in the Netherlands in the northernly parts. Now, that's all relative because South Africa is a lot smaller, of course, than South Africa. So if we talk about from north to south, it's about 4.5 hours. So from here to Georgia is substantially farther, and from east to west, we're talking about 2 hours or 2.5 hours drive. I'm from the north, a place called Groningen, a very pretty city, very similar to Stellenbosch, actually. It's got a high student population. About 60% of the population on that side are students. And the unique thing of Groningen as well is we've got an extremely high bicycle density, or a bike density. So it's actually the highest bike density of the Western world. And so it's logical that I would follow a path that had something to do with cycling. And it's not uncommon for students on that side to have at least 2 or 3 bicycles to get to uni or to work. And the handy part of that, if you've got a flat tire, you don't have to directly fix it. You can just take the other bike and worry about that thing tomorrow. Now, as Professor Miller correctly said as well, I started within the Division of Physiotherapy in 1997, so that was my first visit to South Africa, and actually started at Stellenbosch University. And I'm excited to see that some of these lecturers of those time are still here. Marlette Berger, and I think she's in the audience here as well, and she recently got rewarded her PhD. Maybe I shouldn't say that. Still needs to go through Senate, hey? So almost gets her PhD, but I'm sure she will get there. My more academic career started in 1997 after my physiotherapy degree. I was definitely more interested in not only clinical research work, but also research work as well. And as part of that, I started human movement sciences in Groningen. And as part of my master's project for my MSc, I did a collaborative project under the supervision of Professor Koen Lemming and Chris Visser, and visited the University of Cape Town, and more specifically the Sports Science Institute of South Africa. And as I was there, I did a project under the supervision of Mark Lambert. I correctly then initially returned back to the Netherlands. Before, in 2004, I came back to South Africa and started my PhD under the supervision of Mike. And through my wife, we did a lot of clinical research under the supervision of Professor Kit Vaughan. From there, 2014, I moved back to my initial university, Stellenbosch University, and started working initially as a research consultant for the Department of Orthopedic Surgery, where I assisted and helped out with setting up the research culture on that side. As we just heard, Wayne joined this department with the Institute of Sport and Exercise Medicine, which gave me a chance to also do more sports research again, which was great. And more recently, I moved to the Division of Movement Science and Exercise Therapy, which looks after all biokineticists and kinetics, and I assist with the supervision on that side as well. So let's talk about finding the balance in high-performance cycling. Now, if I talk about finding the balance, I'm not talking exactly about the next video clip that I'm going to show you, but I think it's typical on where we roughly are. So let's have a look. That was not supposed to happen. Now we don't know the cliffhanger there, so let's see if we can restart that. Is that possible to start? So this clearly didn't happen in the first attempt. I think we're putting back the mic up here. But being able to maintain the balance between training load on the one side and recovery on the other side is extremely important for high performance sport. We're gaining the most performance-wise on balancing right on that level. So training as hard as we can and making sure we still have sufficient recovery afterwards as well. And so monitoring this is a critical part and has become a critical part of looking after cyclists in high performance cycling. If that goes wrong, then we have a problem. And so I'll tell you a little bit about where I came from, how we developed the tools that we have these days with regards to that. So just from basic components, if we talk about training in general, we actually train, and through that process, our performance capacity decreases. And we need to counteract that with what we call recovery, a phase in which we can supercompensate from that training on itself to actually land up on a higher platform. So if we do that multiple times correctly, we actually end up at a higher performance capacity and a higher training status. And we can quantify that as effective training. The problem, however, is if you train too hard and your recovery is too little, you actually create a problem of not improving your performance capacity, which is problematic. Alternatively, if you train correctly, but your recovery is too short or insufficient because of malnutrition, psychological stress, or other components, you've got the same effect as well. And your performance capacity doesn't go up. And this applies to the broad capacity of people training, but it definitely applies more important as well for high performance sport. And so we call that ineffective training, and it actually generally is associated with a decrease in performance capacity. So monitoring, when we go back to the early 2000s, it barely existed, because the only way to make sure that that balance is maintained is to actually look and monitor that balance as well. So the initial studies that were done in those times were what we call a maximal performance test and a time trial test. These are referred to as something called a PPO, a peak power output test, and a VO2 max test, which basically is a test in which you increase the wattage or the resistance on somebody's ergometer that he's cycling on, and to determine what is his maximal power output and what is the maximal capacity of oxygen that he can take up. We also did endurance tests, which we generally did through time trials. So that could be a half-hour time trial or a 30-minute or a 40K, but nothing more than that was there. The problem with these tests were, because they're really hard and they're really tiring, we couldn't do them on a regular basis. So they were only performed maybe once or twice a year. So they were good to establish a basic status, but they weren't great for monitoring purposes as well. There were a few submaximal tests, like the Ostron test, the physical work capacity test, but both of them as well were designed to predict PPO and VO2 max, and not really for monitoring purposes. Then we had field data, but field data in those days looked totally different. We had for the first time a thing called a heart rate monitor, with this like black band that you would wear around your wrist, and you had this fancy watch that then showed you your heart rate. So this is totally different to the day and age that we currently live in. And then the other thing was developed as well was this little magnet that you put into your wheel, and it would spin around, and you would actually say, oh, I'm doing 35 Ks an hour. So the data availability on that side was totally different in those days than all. So when I started my PhD, we focused a lot around developing submaximal performance tests and see if we could develop anything around that as well to assist cyclists. And then now there's a lot of changes in field tests as well. So based on that, I'm going to try to take you through a journey, my journey of what we've developed on that side, with highlighting the main findings of a few papers. So the development of the LSCT, and I'm going to only say this once, the LSCT actually stands for the Lamberts and Lamberts submaximal cycle test, which actually started as a joke between my supervisor at the time. But the first time we got a paper published, we actually were hooked onto it. We never thought it would actually develop in such a widely used test. Nowadays, we call it the LSCT. It's a lot easier, but yeah, it's got a bit of a funny background. Actually, I'm going to take you through a few steps. We're going to tell you a little bit about the history and the development of the LSCT. Where did it come from, and how did we came up with the design? I'm going to briefly talk about the reliability and the validity of the test. I'm going to talk a little bit about, can we use that test now to fine-tune training, and does it really work in that say? And can we use the LSCT to predict functional overreaching? And I'll go more into detail why it's so important to be able to see when somebody's getting functionally overreached. So the history behind the LSCT. Like most things in South Africa, it all started with rugby. And so this goes back to the early 2000s, even before my time, before I got involved. And my professor, Mike Lambert, who was my supervisor later on, developed something called the heart rate interval monitoring system, HIMSS, a test that was developed for rugby and rugby players to be able to see we can monitor them a little bit better how things were doing. It was a submaximal running protocol that existed of 4 different stages and increased in speed throughout, starting at 8.4, finishing at 12 kilometers per hour. And during those tests, we looked at the submaximal heart rate that the athletes elicited. And we also looked at heart rate recovery after each of the stages to get insight into what is happening there. Why heart rate recovery? Well, heart rate recovery is a really interesting measurement tool for us. Why? Because it's regulated by what we call autonomic nervous system, which exactly exists out of 2 main components, which on the one side is the sympathetic nervous system, which is your active system. So it regulates the upregulation of heart rate, breathing rate, blood pressure. So it basically gets you ready to exercise. And on the other side, we've got the parasympathetic nervous system, which actually regulates your recovery component. So it brings your breathing down. It makes your pupils contract a little bit again as well. It really makes sure that you recover properly from those. And the great part from this response, it's not only related to physiological parameters, but also psychological parameters. So psychological stress influences heart rate recovery, and another modern way of looking at it is heart rate variability. And so there's multiple tools out there, especially on the heart rate variability side, that can give guidance on stress levels in people and also trying to do that. So for us, heart rate recovery was an interesting aspect to look at as well. So we've done a couple of different studies on the HIMSS. The first HIMSS test that we did is we basically looked at, okay, how reliable is heart rate recovery and after which specific stage? And why is heart rate recovery reliability important? Well, the more reliable it is, the shorter the amount of beats we have, the higher the sensitivity is to detect the difference. So let's take an example. If I've got a variability of 10 beats on a day-to-day basis, then 11 beats tells me there is something abnormal happening. Where if my heart rate, my reliability is only 5 beats, then 6 beats is something different. So for us, it was important to establish where that was. And we actually found in this initial study that there was a variation of about 8 beats, and we found it after the final 4th stage of the HIMSS. Now, a couple of years later, we realized that the HIMSS test and the people who were part of this test were not evenly fit. So we actually classified them based on the heart rate that they received at the end of the test. So some people who were really fit, they had a relatively low heart rate, below 85% of their max heart rate. And for some people, it was really tiring, and the test actually pushed them up over 90% of max heart rate. And we looked within these different groups, where would we find the lowest variability and the highest reliability in those tests. And we actually showed that in that group, between 85 and 90% of heart rate max actually showed that we only had day-to-day variation of about 3 beats. So that gave us an important clue. It, however, led to the question, is this coincidence? Or if we adapt the speeds of those teams, does it then also result in a better heart rate recovery or with a lower heart rate variability? So just take an example. The under 85% group, for which the HIMSS was actually too easy, we made them do a slightly harder HIMSS so that the heart rate at the end of the test also roughly would fall within 85 to 90%, and see if that actually influenced the reliability of that study. And what we actually showed that it did. The heart rate variability in most of those cases actually dropped back from about 7 to about 3. So this gave us a very important clue with heart rate recovery from which rough intensity we wanted to measure heart rate recovery in the most reliable way. This, by the way, was a study that was done by Simon Maskell. He's a little sidestep on it. He's a biokineticist who moved over to the UK and is currently pushing really hard to get biokinetics on the cards there, and he's definitely succeeding. So he's an interesting person and clearly closely related to our division as well. So at the same time, I already started getting involved in cycling research as well. And one of the first cycling studies that I did was together with Jeroen Swart. And we did a high-intensity interval training study in which we asked cyclists to perform high-interval training. We did 8 times 4 minutes at 80% of peak power output. And this study was weird. We couldn't make it work. And what we realized afterwards is this high-interval training session setup, we copied from another paper, and everybody was able to cope. However, the one thing that we did differently is that we didn't use a step protocol, which is indicated by the dash scores here, but we used the incremental ramp protocol to determine peak power output. So the maximal 100% peak power output, of which we then take 80% to prescribe those intervals. And so what happened with this is, as we found out later, is that peak power output protocol actually pushed the peak power output up about 20 to 30 watts. And so what we indirectly did, we didn't realize at a point in time, we overtrained half the group of our population. Not on purpose, but that was the consequence, because they weren't able to cope with the high intensity load, where the other group was able to cope with the intensity. So after analyzing the data, we had a group of what we call the responders, and we had another group that we call the non-responders. And you see the clear differences in performance. So yes, the non-responders still went up by about 1% in peak power output, so the wattage that they were able to push away. And the other group went up by 4.4. Even more so, you can see it in the power during the 40K time trial, which on the one group went up by more than 8%, and the only less than 4. So there was a big difference between these two groups as well. And then what we did as well, we looked at the heart rate recovery in these groups. And there we saw an interesting pattern. And luckily we captured heart rate recovery after each test and after each interval. And with the group that really responded well, we saw a continuous increase in heart rate recovery throughout all the sessions. But with the group that didn't respond, you actually saw a curvature that happened around the 5th or 6th interval session, and they started to come down. So likely in this case, it might have been that specific group wasn't coping well, and we should have actually stopped at the 6th session and not at another 7th and the 8th, because that pushed them just over the limit and they weren't able to cope. So again, this was an interesting finding for us that heart rate recovery was definitely something that we wanted to look into. This all contributed to the design of the LSCT. The design of the LSCT was actually then built up and kept in time with what we roughly want a cyclist from a warm-up point of view, around 15 minutes or so. And we designed it in such a way that we asked the cyclist to cycle at heart rate. So this was an interesting twist in the thing. We didn't ask them to ride at a specific power, but we asked them to ride a specific heart rate. So we're swapping the targets now. The great part of that is that we now could measure heart rate recovery each time from one specific heart rate. So at least that heart rate recovery would even be more reliable. And as we didn't ask them to run on an indoor floor between 2 meters, between 20 meters like we did in the HIMSS, this was a lot easier to do because you fix somebody onto a cycle ergometer and it's very easy to see your heart rate. So this specific group, that worked really well. So the first stage was 60% for 6 minutes at 60%. Then we had a phase in which they cycled 6 minutes at 80%. And then a last component at 90%. And of course, this wasn't coincidence that it was 90%, because we learned from our previous research that if we want to measure heart rate recovery accurately, then we should try to push them up between 86 and 93%. And of course, that gave us a way to then measure heart rate recovery quite accurately afterwards as well. Then in addition, in the initial studies, we captured the power output, so the wattage that they were able to push out at the specific target heart rates as well. And we captured something what we call the rating of perceived exertion. So this is an indication for people who are not familiar with it that runs from 6 to 20 or some from 0 to 10, in which you indicate subjectively how hard is this stage. Very easy, hard, extremely hard. And then over the years, we've started adding a lot of extra components to it. So we looked at cadence, we looked at the rate of increase, so how quickly does that heart rate go up, because that shows you something about the autonomic nervous system as well. Heart rate variability was added to it, specific ratios between different components. And we also were able to do some research in the environmental chamber so we could correct for environmental conditions. So then very briefly on the validity and reliability, these are not always the most interesting parts of a study to do, but I think they're critical to do. We found really good reliability components. So when I talk about really good, we saw that at the second stage, we had about a variation of about 8.5 watts. That went down as the intensity increases to about 4.6 watts. And heart rate recovery actually even came further down. So we're roughly sitting at around 3 beats, and now it's coming down to about 2 beats. And this is probably can be explained by the fact that everybody each time around would recover from exactly the same submaximal heart rate. So we could conclude that the LSCT was a valid and reliable tool, and we could move forward with that. And this was a study, again, this was done by Richard Woolrich back in the UCT days. So then the LSCT is a tool. Can we use that tool to actually guide training or not? And this was a study that was done by Ben Capistanho. This was another high interval training study in which we asked cyclists to perform 21-minute intervals interspaced with 2-minute recovery. And we actually split up the group. So the one group, the structured group, would come in on a Tuesday and a Thursday, and they would do their interval training. They did a submaximal test before, but we didn't take anything into account of that, and we just collected the data. Then we had a flexible group that would come in on a Monday, a Wednesday, and a Friday, and they would perform the submaximal test. And based on that, we would then argue, okay, they're fit enough to do a training session, or they're not fit enough to do a training session. And so there was a possibility for the flexible group to do their training faster, in the same time, or slower, and the only difference between the two groups was the amount of resting days. So they were fully matched for training load. And clearly in those days things weren't perfect, because we're still working with humans, but if you look at the data here of the flexible group, you see much more a uniform response than what we see on the structured group. So for some people the structured prescription was spot on, but for some of them that we see, for instance, in S1, but for some of them it wasn't spot on, it was actually too much and they weren't coping. This is a classical example, is here's structured number 8. And if you then look at the overall components, we saw clear differences as well. So the group on the 40K time trial improved by about 48 seconds in the flexible group, while it was only 8 in the other group. So this again points out that individualized training is really important. And it's not a one-size-fits-all model, which we probably all know. Again, what happened to heart rate recovery in this study? Well, interestingly, we saw a similar response into the other study as well. The group that was able to really improve in that flexible group showed a slow increase in heart rate recovery throughout the training sessions, where the other group basically stayed the same or actually slightly dropped off a little bit as well. So there seems to be truth. There seems to be practical application of using the LSCT to prescribe training. But another important factor as well, if we go back to maintaining a healthy balance, is can the LST reflect functional overreaching? Now, before we can go there, I briefly need to tell you a little bit about what is functional overreaching. Well, if we look at training process, we can actually break it down into an outcome, a rough amount of recovery days that we need, and what the response is from a performance side. So normal training, as I just explained in that graphic as well, you get acute fatigue directly after your training session. You generally need a day or less to recover from, and you slowly build up your training status. Then we got something that we call intensified training. The first part of this is what we call functional overreaching. This is a state where we really push athletes a little bit harder than normal, but still within range, and we generally do that in cycling during training camps. And they take a little bit longer to recover from. It's a highly effective way of training cyclists, especially high-performance cyclists who do a lot of endurance. So you need to mix up the bag of doing an endurance work, but also high-interval training work. And it's a really effective way that works really well. But it's tricky as well because you're very close to something what we call non-functional overreaching. And non-functional overreaching is something that we don't want to go. Because as you can see on the graph here as well, it takes weeks to months to generally recover from, which is not ideal from that specific perspective. And if it doesn't stop there and you fully further develop it, you can actually develop something called an overtraining syndrome. An overtraining syndrome takes months, sometimes years to recover from. And for most elite athletes, unless you've got an extremely good background, this means the end of your career. Maybe if you called Marianne Vos, who won 7 world titles or not more, then you get the opportunity and the support, but for most of them it's well. So from a monitoring point of view, you want to monitor at the level of acute fatigue and functional overreaching. And probably even more importantly around functional overreaching, you want to be able to pick up early markers of functional overreaching because this is a moment where you can still intervene and people can actually bounce back quite quickly afterwards as well. So being able to do that is really important. Now, we've done one of the first studies on this, which we clearly didn't do on purpose, but we found quite a few papers. And without going into all detail, a recent study by Annemieke Rutte gave a very nice overview of it. So there's multiple studies that now have used the LSCT. Those are not all my studies, by the way. These are studies that were done, other data collected with me being present there. This example of this was a study with Lucilla Ducroix, who worked with a lot of Sudal ladies at the time. Another project where we weren't involved at all was a project at the southern parts in Germany by Danielle Hammers. And she provided an overview of, okay, what do we see in these athletes that are getting functionally overreached? And the first thing that we saw is the rating of perceived exertion goes up. Okay, that's logical. If I'm tired and I'm cycling at the same intensity, it feels harder. Okay, that makes sense to me. Okay. So, but then what we did find was some strange responses. So if we looked at when you're riding at a specifically fixed heart rate, your power output, I would think, would go down, but actually what we saw, it went up. And if we would turn the tables, we say, okay, we'll fix power output, what's happening to heart rate, you would think when you're tired, it's probably going to be higher, but it was actually lower. So there was a funny response that we couldn't really explain initially. And then what we saw as well, we saw a faster heart rate recovery, which is also a little bit counterintuitive of what we find, what we initially assumed that would happen. So let's bring that a little bit further back and look at that. So if we talk about an improved training status, you would expect power at the same heart rate to go up. So let's say you're riding at 160 beats per minute, your training status is a little bit better. Now you're not riding at 200 watts, but now you're being able to ride at 220 watts. And so the interesting part is we see a similar response in functional overreaching. And heart rate recovery, if your training status improves, your heart rate recovery recovers faster. And the same thing we see in functional overreaching. The big difference here, this is a sudden change. A sudden change that suddenly happened basically from week 1 to the next week. Now, for high performance cyclists and for most of us, that's impossible. Well, it's not 100% impossible, but it's illegal then. Because then we need to use other substances, and that's not where we're about. But this was a sudden increase. So if you're suddenly being able to ride a 40K time trial, and you're an elite athlete who performs at world tour level, and you're able to push out 20 watts more, then you're either you're doing things that you're not supposed to do, or clearly something is going wrong. Okay, so that's clearly something that we had to look into. Where it did was different, of course, was the RP. But I think what we learned from this is, and what has been shown in multiple papers now, is that we cannot look purely at one component. Because if we only look at power output at a specific heart rate, we're being led in the wrong way. Because you could interpret it as an improved training status while your athlete is actually overreaching. So you need to have a multifaceted effect to look at that. And then from there, we're currently busy in the development of a fatigue index. It's been standing still for a while, but it's something that I hope to pick up again quite soon, in which we basically weigh different factors to each other that helps us to detect that functional overreaching in a very early state, and we can provide feedback to the coaches to do that. Is it a perfect test? No, never. I think the tests always got their pros and their cons and their limitations, and one of the limitations that we got within the LSAT, it's been performed in a lab. It's performed on a bike. It's not outside. So outside, the temperature is not controlled. The road circumstances are totally different. When you sit on an indoor bike, and I'm sure you've all experienced that when you sit in the gym, you hold your leg still, the bicycle stops. If you ride on the road and you go down Chappies, you hold your leg still and the bike still rolls. So there's differences between what we do in the lab and what's happening in the field. So those are things that we cannot specifically control for. What we picked up as well is that when people get really fatigued or overreached, cyclists struggle to elicit the target heart rate at stage 3. Now there's two stories of that side. The one side is great because we can use it as an indicator that they're not coping. But practically, a lot of cyclists have an issue with this. It's too hard, I'm not coping. And so I think that stopped partially the flow through to the practical world. Although I cannot complain, I'll show you just now. It's being picked up by quite a few teams. They've adapted it, but it doesn't matter. That's what it's for. And then I think the other thing as well is we look at the LSCT in a relatively rested state. So we always do it on a rest day, which is on the one side fine, but it's also got a limitation. I'll come back to that a little bit more just now when we go to look a little bit at the field data. What is the biggest compliment? Well, the biggest compliment is your test is either being used or have been used, and in some cases been adapted in other teams all around the world. So for me, that to see that, and it doesn't have to be exactly the same. Some people clamp the FTP, some people look at critical power, some people leave the third stage away, but the great thing is it's being used in different teams all cycling except for one, and it's the right-hand bottom one, which is Oxford rowing. They transferred it into a rowing test, and they use it to select their rowers for Oxford rowing. So this is for me is the biggest compliment when you see that other people pick it up and do their work with it and take their benefit from it. So that's what I call applied research. All right, then let's go to field data. A lot of things have changed, hey? A lot of things have changed in cycling. We got gears these days. Those old bikes didn't have gears. Your tubes you don't wear around your shoulders when you go up chappies for the augers. And so clearly a lot of things have changed here. We've now got light machines. We actually need to regulate that they're not too heavy. And so that has changed the game a lot. And the one thing that really has changed a lot in cycling is this little device here that shows the power output that a cyclist is able to ride at. So we've got devices now, generally they are based in the crank, that provides us exactly how much resistance are you able to push back, and it provides us insight in not only their training, but also in races as well. And there have been people that said, listen, we need to get this power away because it takes the fun out of cycling, because they know exactly what they can do and how they can control the race. But on the other side, it also provided us with a lot of opportunities to do research. So over the last couple of years, we've done a lot of research, and a lot of credit should go out here to Teun van Erp. Teun is the guy that you probably see with most of the similar faces on this thing. He had a unique database in which we can have done a lot of work. Besides that, we've worked together with Spanish groups as well. And I'm going to pick out two examples of field data that we used and that's been really useful in this setup as well. So a little bit of background. Power profile, what is power profile? Well, a power profile, within that what we look at mean maximal power outputs, so average powers over different time frames. So we get a file from the power, and then we look at, okay, what's your highest 5-second power output, what's your 10-second power output, up to about 180, which we then call the shorter power outputs. And then we can also look at longer components as well. Okay, what is your average power that you can push out for 20 minutes? That provides novel insight in what a cyclist can do, and then we can create a curve from that over time, which we then call a power profile. So the first example that I'm going to talk about is sprinting in cycling. Now, this is a case study that we did through Teun, and we did with a guy called Marcel Kittel. He's one of the top sprinters during the Tour de France. He's retired now, and sprinting is very complex. It's not straightforward, and you make sure you're at the front of the peloton and then you finish. So I'm trying to show you a little movie clip. If correct, we don't have sound here, and as you can see here, position is critically important. It's critically important that during the last 150 meters or so, you're exactly at the right spot. And you can see here that if you look at the team components, it's a lot of shouting. It's making sure you're at the right place. You're drafting around the right person, because it saves a lot of energy as well, to make sure that your sprinter of your team is exactly in the right spot where he needs to be when it gets to those last 150 meters. So with Marcel Kittel, we had unique data. We had data from 4 Tour de France's, 2013, 2014, and 2016 and 2017. And on top of that, he cycled for 2 different teams. The first team is a team called Giant Shimano. Today it's called DSM. And then there's another team called Ethics Quickstep. Now, there were 2 tactical main differences between the 2 teams. Giant Shimano, he was the top sprinter. They went to the Tour to get as many sprint finishes and sprint wins throughout the Tour, which meant that the entire team would ride for Marcel Kittel by the time we finished their race. And with Ethics Quickstep, it was totally different. He had 2 support people, Jenny at the end of the race, sometimes 3. And this was because there was multiple people that played an important role. They had a GC rider, a general classification rider, who was going to the best position overall. And so the tactics around that then absolutely changed. So those are the power output for the people who are interested in power output. So average duration of the sprint, we're talking about 13 seconds, but you need to make sure you put that 411 watts spot on at the right time. And we're getting high speeds and high cadences as well. So we then look at pacing strategies, and we go 10 minutes back before people actually finish the race. We see a totally different tactic. So we got on the y-axis in the position, and you can see that when he was cycling with Giant Shimano, he would already sit in the top 30 riders while when he was with attics, he would actually sit much more towards the back of the peloton. And so that influences power profiles throughout a sprint like that. And especially in that last component, you can see it here already a little bit, that there's a lot of places that you need to gain in that last component if you're not put into the right position. So if we look at power output, you can see, especially in that last 30 to 15 seconds, that the power that he needs to be able to push out is significantly higher. And we're talking about 200 watts plus. So this is extremely insightful for us as coaches and researchers. The tactic of preparing for a sprint might be different when you're running for a different team with different support levels as well. The other thing that we looked at is position. Okay, where is it so important? Well, the last 30 seconds, and then we're roughly talking about the last 150 meters before the finish, you need to be able to sit around the fourth position. If you're not there at that time, your chances of actually grabbing that win are extremely low. So there's a clear significant difference between those components as well. Okay, then the last study that I'm going to talk about before we start wrapping up. Power output and fatigue. And if I talk about that, I can most easily compare that to a graph here. So as I said before, and what we do with the submaximal test, we're looking at power outputs, we're looking at training status, readiness to train in a rested state. But in a rested state, you're not going to win the tour or a race. The race is being won in a fatigue state. So I think what we did here is we actually had a large database. So we're doing all the testing there while we're not looking at the end of a race. And we looked at highly successful cyclists and less successful cyclists. And we looked at the power outputs while they were riding races. So when they were fresh, and we quantify that as 0 kilojoules per kilogram burned, or when they were towards the latter part of a race, where they were sitting around 50 kilojoules per kilogram burned. So we actually used the amount of kilojoules that they burned as an indicator of accumulating fatigue levels. And then we looked at their changes over time, and we did that in climbers and in sprinters, and we did that over 4 different power output metrics of 10 seconds, 1 minute, 5 minutes, and 20 minutes. And for today, I'll briefly be speaking about 10 seconds and 20 minutes. So let's have a very brief look at sprinters. What do we see in sprinters? Now let's have a look first on the right. This is the 20-minute mean maximal power output. So we're talking about the mean power that they can maintain throughout the race for 20 minutes. And as you would expect, as the race goes further on, we're seeing a drop in the power that they're being able to produce. So they drop off by about 16 to 14%, but still relatively similar in both groups. When we look, so there's no real significant difference in that between the highly successful and the not successful. But if we look at that in their 15 seconds or the 10 seconds MMPs in this case, we see significant differences. And clearly this makes sense because as we just learned from the sprinting, this is generally happening in a 10 to 13 second window. And now what we're seeing here is that the successful sprinters only drop off 8.6%. while the less successful sprinters actually drop off around 17%. So we're talking about almost a 10% difference. Now, you can argue that this partially might have to do with the fact that, those other riders and support riders and sprinters help the first person. Absolutely true, but still the gap is relatively big. And insight into this data gives us novel insight. Who should we place in what specific position, and is it trainable or not? Is fatigue, resistance and durability of that trainable or not, or should we use that also selection criteria for what role each cyclist plays in a specific team? Because there can only be one GC rider. There cannot be 4. There's generally only one. So if we then look at climbers, we will see the opposite. We don't see differences in the 10-second component towards the end of a race, but in those climbing races, we see clear differences in their the 20-minute mean maximal power output. So we see that their last climb, they're able to ride a significantly higher power, as of course we expect. But again, those differences are significantly. We're talking about 5% differences, and that's a lot for a high-performance group, a very unique elite high-performance group. So the question is, should we use submaximal testing? Should we use field data to monitor high-performance cycling? Well, again, I think we're back to where we started. We probably need to have a balance between both. I think they both give us insights into into what cyclists do, and both sides have pros and cons. So combining the two will probably be your best chance to find the best optimal monitoring system to help these athletes. Okay, that brings me to the end of my inaugural lecture. I hope it was at least understandable for most of you online and here in the audience. There's a few recognitions and thank yous that I need to do. First of all, I would really like to thank Mike Lambert. Mike, you've been my PhD supervisor and at the cradle of my career in academics. So thank you very much for being there. Professor Git Vaughan, who I did a lot of clinical research with. I'm still very close with both Kit and Joan as well. So yeah, thank you a lot. It's too little time to show everything that I do. The clinical side is really fun and important as well. Then I really need to thank Vicky and Wayne. Vicky was the person who took me in within orthopedic surgery on this side to help set up the research. We've been highly successful, but it wouldn't be possible without his help and guidance. And Wayne, of course, as well, being part of and choosing orthopedics to host ISIM initially in the first time, allowing me to be back and part of ISIM again as well. It's been an absolute privilege. Then two people I really need to thank. Nico, you've been instrumental, and you might not be even aware of that, but you've been instrumental in my progress here at Stellenbosch University, giving me the tools to do what I need to do. And that's a critical role, because you need to have the trust and the possibilities to show what you can do. And of course I did that. Hopefully I did that. But it's not possible without the support of the Dean management team. In that same light, I really needed to thank Jimmy. I think both Jimmy and Nico were the reasons why we initially created a post within orthopedics to boost the research on that side, which we luckily successfully did. Which, by the way, Marlies Berger now has taken over with great succession as well, which was great to see. But thank you, Jimmy. You've been, like Nico, instrumental and a key factor in my success here, I think, at the other side. As you've probably seen, it's not only male people that I need to thank as well, because there's three ladies that I really need to thank as part of this as well. The last year and a half has been academically really rough, and we're not going to go into the details of it, but these ladies from the department and division that I currently fall in, Chandra within the division of sports science, Eileen within MSET, and my head of division as well, Corin, thank you for making me feel welcome. I'm sure we'll always bounce back, but I'm really, really grateful for that. Thank you. Then, of course, my family. Unfortunately, they can't be here due to circumstances. My parents, my brother, my little one, my wife, and my dog, who looks more like a seal on this picture. So I thought, let me put them in, then at least I can bounce a little bit away to not get too emotional. But yeah, thank you again as well. I think, these achievements are never done without the support of family, and I'm truly grateful for that. And there I'll leave it for today with regard to my inaugural. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Professor Lamberts. So I'm Wim de Villiers, Rector and Vice Chancellor of Stellenbosch University, and it's my absolute pleasure to express a vote of thanks on behalf of the university to Professor Lamberts for his inaugural lecture. And I will also hand him a certificate soon, but not quite yet. So there were 3 points that he made. I thought I heard when he welcomed his audience and he welcomed me, that he said, did he say avid, did he say keen sportsman and cyclist, or did he say accomplished? I don't think he said accomplished, and I don't blame him for that, because in the title, Finding the Balance in High Performance Cycling, I lack both balance and high performance. But I've now actually finally understood why this high performance issue has been troubling me, and that is non-functional overreaching and overtraining. Or it could also be ascribed to not training at all, but anyway, that's a different, you could publish on that as well. But a fascinating talk, so thank you very much for that. The second point is I'm so pleased that you've joined us here from the Netherlands. And it's part of the university's internationalization strategy and what you're a testament to that. And also to the success of our exchange programs as well. So we have 32,000 students. We have more than 4,500 international students. Most of them, 60% of them from the African continent, number one, number two, always interchangeably Namibia and Zimbabwe, but a very good number from the Netherlands, a good number from Germany, and actually over the last 2 years of the pandemic, 400 to 500 French students a year, both undergraduate and postgraduate from the Schema Business School. So you'll hear a lot of French being spoken in Stellenbosch. But I'm very pleased also, so you got your first degree at Groningen, and Groningen is a very valued partner, strategic partner of ours, an institutional partner. And actually last week I met with delegates also from Groningen. They were part of the Guild group of universities, the Guild group of 21 European universities that visited Stellenbosch last week. And the leadership of Groningen is actually visiting Stellenbosch at the beginning of December. And as I'm always keen to say, I tend to be envious of the leadership of European and Dutch universities in particular, because they're not only called rector, they're called rector magnificus. But I haven't been able to convince Senate to do that here. But anyway, one thing that I do know about the Netherlands and cycling is that clearly cyclists, and that explains why your field of interest as well, clearly cyclists are considered the highest order human beings because they always have the right of way above everybody else, and they don't wear helmets. I must say that is quite something, not wearing helmets. So I'm very pleased that we have an international recruit here, and you as part of our team. And that is the last point that I want to commend you on. And that is that you started off and you showed that great slide about all your collaborators, all the people you've published with. And that's the point, is that you acknowledge the importance of team in what you've established. And since you've come to Stellenbosch, you've also a very valued member of our team in terms of your presence on the Research Ethics Committee, quite a long period now, and that is a very important job at the Faculty of Medicine and Health Sciences. And also your role as a recognized academic in acting as a supervisor for a number of postgraduate students. And I think that it was very clear in your talk is the passion and is the fire in the belly. So I am very pleased that you're here with us and that you've chosen to, and that we have been successful in having you at Stellenbosch, in professing, in being a professor here and professing at Stellenbosch University. So thank you very much, Rob, and here's your certificate. And your hat.
Thank you.
Thank you, Professor de Villiers, Professor Lamberts. Thank you very much for all those kind words. So, colleagues and friends, all that remains for me is to actually just thank the organizers of this evening. As you know, these events don't happen by themselves, so many people are part of the planning and the hard work, and so I would like to express my gratitude to Megan Salon and her team, Florence, everyone else from the Marketing Communications Division for the overall organization, to Menwin and Justin, Menwin Samboer and Justin Alberts for the audiovisual organization, Russell Anthony for the facilities preparations, and campus security for their assistance, and everyone else who has contributed to making this a special evening. So now I can declare the proceedings closed. I would like to invite you all to have some light refreshments down the passage in the Dean's reception area. Thank you very much for coming and for listening, and for everyone online for making this a wonderful event. And enjoy the rest of the evening and drive safely. Thank you.